David had lived in the same small house at the edge of a quiet Arizona town for almost 10 years. It was a calm place. The roads were wide and dusty. The sky looked bigger than anywhere else, and the air always carried the soft smell of desert wind. Across the narrow dirt road from his home stood another house, a simple adobe home with white walls and a blue door. That house belonged to Marlene, an Apache widow who had lived there most of her life. Marlene was a woman who didn't talk much, but everyone in the area knew her. She was respected and liked because she was kind, calm, and strong. She took care of her small piece of land with quiet pride. She grew vegetables in a garden behind her house, kept 2 horses, and often sang old songs in a soft voice when the sun went down. People would sometimes hear her singing when they walked past in the evenings. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried something warm and gentle that stayed in people's hearts. David first noticed her on a bright summer morning. He had just moved into his house, a simple place he bought after his retirement. That morning, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, trying to get used to the silence. Across the road, he saw Marlene working in her garden, her hat wide to protect her from the sun. She moved slowly but with purpose, watering her plants one by one. There was something peaceful about the way she did it, as if she had been doing the same thing for many years. From that day on, David's mornings and evenings slowly became tied to Marlene's routines. He didn't plan it at first. It just happened. When the sun rose, he would sit on his porch with his coffee, and there she would be, watering the plants, brushing her horses, hanging laundry on the wooden line. When the sun set, she would light a small lantern and sit on her porch, looking out at the quiet desert night. David would sit on his porch too, pretending to look at the stars, but really he was watching her. He didn't think of it as spying. He never used binoculars or cameras. He simply watched from a distance. It was quiet, simple, and peaceful. Marlene never seemed to notice. She just lived her life day after day with the same calm energy. As the years passed, this quiet watching became a part of David's daily routine. He didn't have many friends or family nearby. His children lived in different states and rarely visited. Marlene's presence became a gentle comfort in his life. He didn't talk to her, but seeing her every day made him feel less alone. On warm summer nights, the air smelled of mesquite and dust. David would hear the sound of Marlene's horses moving slowly in their pen. Sometimes she would hum old Apache songs, the kind that sounded like the wind moving through the trees. David didn't know the words, but the sound stayed with him. It made him feel safe, like the world wasn't as empty as he sometimes thought it was. There were moments when he almost walked across the road to talk to her, maybe to say hello, maybe to offer help with her fence or carry water buckets. But each time something stopped him. Maybe it was shyness. Maybe it was respect for her quiet way of living. She seemed happy on her own, and David didn't want to disturb that. One winter, a heavy storm hit the town. It was rare for that area, but the wind was strong and the sky turned a deep gray. David sat by his window watching the rain fall. Across the road, Marlene came out with a raincoat and rushed to bring her horses under the small wooden shelter. She moved fast but carefully, making sure they were safe. Her lantern swung in the wind, but her hands were steady. That night, David realized how much he had learned about her without ever speaking a single word to her. He knew that she always fed her horses before sunrise. He knew she liked to sit with her lantern at exactly the same time each night. He knew she smiled when the neighborhood kids passed by her gate. And he knew, deep down, that she had a quiet strength that was hard to find in people these days. When summer returned, David started to notice the little things even more. Sometimes she wore a red scarf around her neck. Sometimes she carried an old radio and listened to soft music while watering her plants. She greeted her grandchildren with open arms when they visited on weekends. The kids would run across her yard laughing, and Marlene would laugh with them. A soft, warm laugh that made the evening air feel brighter. David often thought about how easy it would be to say hello, to walk across the road and start a simple conversation. Maybe about the weather, or her horses, or the garden. But year after year he didn't. He always told himself, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow always became another quiet day of watching from his porch. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to her. He did. But his life had become quiet for so long that starting something new felt big and frightening. So he stayed on his porch, letting time pass, letting the sun rise and set while Marlene continued her quiet routines across the road. Sometimes in the early mornings, Marlene would step out of her house and stand at the gate looking at the sky. David would watch her from his chair, pretending to read the newspaper. He often wondered what she was thinking in those quiet moments. Was she remembering someone she had lost? Was she thinking about her younger days? Or was she simply enjoying the morning like he was? Years passed like this, quiet, calm, and unchanged. David grew older, and so did Marlene. He saw a few new lines appear on her face just as they appeared on his. He noticed her moving a little slower, just as he did. And in some way it felt like their lives were connected, even without a single word spoken between them. One evening, something small but important happened. Marlene was lighting her lantern as she did every night, but the match wouldn't catch. The wind kept blowing it out. She tried again and again, and David felt something inside him shift. For the first time in 10 years, he stood up from his chair. His heart beat fast as he took a step forward, but then he stopped himself. Marlene struck the match again. This time the lantern caught the flame. She smiled softly, the warm light reflecting on her face. David slowly sat back down, both relieved and strangely moved. It was a moment that stayed with him long after the lantern's light faded into the night. Autumn came, and the leaves around town turned gold. David had grown used to the rhythm of Marlene's life. He could almost tell the time of day by what she was doing. When she opened her front door in the morning, when she fed the horses, when she sat on the porch at night. He didn't need a clock anymore. Marlene's quiet life had become the clock of his days. He sometimes imagined what she might think of him if she ever noticed him watching. Maybe she would be surprised. Maybe she would be annoyed. Maybe she wouldn't care at all. But he convinced himself that she never noticed. She seemed too focused on her life to see him sitting on his porch every day. But what David didn't know was that Marlene had always been more aware than he thought. She had sharp eyes. She had lived long enough to notice when someone was watching, even quietly and respectfully. She had seen the man across the road many times. She saw the way he lifted his coffee cup at the same time every morning, how he leaned back in his chair every evening. She noticed the way he smiled when her grandchildren laughed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. One cold evening, just as the sun disappeared and the sky turned a soft blue, Marlene turned her head. David was in his usual spot on the porch holding his coffee. This time their eyes met. It wasn't a quick glance. It was a long, calm look, steady and quiet, just like everything between them for the past 10 years. And in that silent moment, David finally understood something he had never thought about before. She had known all along. The desert wind moved softly between them. No words were spoken, but something changed that night. It was as if 10 years of quiet watching had finally been seen. David felt a mix of surprise, warmth, and nervousness. He didn't know what would happen next, but deep inside, he knew that the quiet story between them was no longer one-sided. The next morning felt different to David, though nothing around him had actually changed. The same wide desert stretched out beyond his porch. The same wind carried soft dust across the road. The same birds perched on the fence, chirping as the sun rose slowly into the clear sky. But inside him something had shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment from the night before, the quiet, steady way Marlene had met his gaze. For 10 years he had convinced himself that she never noticed, but now it was clear she had known all along. It wasn't a quick glance or a confused look. It was the calm look of someone who had quietly accepted his presence. David sat on his porch holding his coffee cup, trying to act as normal as possible. But every sound, every movement from across the road made his heart beat just a little faster. He watched as Marlene stepped out of her house just like she did every morning. She wore the same wide hat, carried her old watering can, and began tending to her plants. But something was new. As she turned to water a row of flowers, she paused for a moment. Her eyes met his again. This time she smiled, and not a big smile, but a small, warm one. The kind of smile that felt like a gentle nudge rather than a loud announcement. David froze, unsure whether to smile back. Then, without really thinking, he lifted his coffee cup slightly, like a silent greeting. Marlene tilted her head slightly, almost like she was saying, "I see you." The rest of the day, David couldn't focus on anything. He tried reading, tried fixing the loose board on his porch, even tried taking a nap. But his thoughts kept returning to that smile. For 10 years, their lives had been silent but connected, and now, it felt like that silence had quietly opened a door. That evening, when the sun was sinking low and the desert sky turned golden, David stepped outside like he always did. He expected Marlene to be sitting on her porch with her lantern, but she wasn't there. For the first time in a long time, her porch was empty. He felt a strange, soft disappointment he couldn't explain, but then he noticed something on his porch railing. A small woven basket. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, a few pieces of warm fry bread, and a note. The handwriting was neat and simple. It said, "You've been watching long enough. Come over for coffee." David stood there for a long time, the note shaking slightly in his hand even though there was no wind. It was such a simple invitation, but for him it felt enormous. 10 years of silence had suddenly turned into 7 quiet, powerful words. He didn't go over that night. Instead, he placed the basket carefully on his table and sat staring at it until the lantern light across the road finally appeared again. He could see Marlene sitting quietly, just like always. But now everything felt different. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. He stood in front of the mirror, unsure why he cared so much about how he looked. He combed his hair neatly, ironed a shirt he hadn't worn in months, and even polished his old shoes. He laughed at himself a little. At his age, he didn't usually get nervous. But that morning, he felt like a shy boy again. Finally, with slightly trembling hands, David walked down the steps of his porch and crossed the dirt road. It wasn't a long distance. In fact, it was probably less than 20 steps, but it felt like the longest walk of his life. Marlene was already outside, standing at her gate as if she knew he was coming. She wasn't wearing anything special, just her usual clothes, her hat, and that small, calm smile. When David reached the gate, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. She let out a soft laugh, not loud or teasing, but the kind of laugh that made a person feel at ease. "You walk slower than the sun," she said kindly. David finally laughed too, a little nervously. I wasn't sure if I should come." She tilted her head. "Then why did you?" He thought for a moment. "Because you asked." She nodded, then opened the gate. "Well, then you better have some coffee." The air inside Marlene's yard smelled like flowers and fresh bread. She led him to her porch where a small wooden table stood with 2 chairs. A coffee pot steamed gently in the cool morning air. She poured 2 cups without asking how he liked it. The moment felt so natural, as if they had been doing this for years. For a few minutes, they just sat in silence. But it wasn't the same silence they'd shared from across the road all these years. This was warm, close silence, and the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. Finally, Marlene spoke. "You've been out there every morning." "Every evening, too." David froze, his cup halfway to his lips. "You noticed," she smiled. "I noticed the second week you moved in." His eyes widened slightly. "That long?" She nodded. "I've lived here all my life. I notice when the wind shifts. I notice when someone watches kindly." David looked down, a little embarrassed. "I hope it didn't bother you." "It didn't," she said softly. "Some people watch to take. Others watch because they care. You were quiet, respectful. I got used to it. It became part of my days." David felt something warm in his chest. All these years, he thought he was the only one who felt connected. But she had felt it too, in her own quiet way. As the sun climbed higher, they talked a little more. He told her about his children who lived far away, about how quiet his life had become after retirement. She shared small stories about her horses, her grandchildren, and how she loved sitting outside listening to the wind. It wasn't a deep conversation. They didn't talk about heavy things, but every word felt like a step closer. From that day on, David's life changed in small, gentle ways. Some mornings, he still drank his coffee on his own porch, but more and more often, he crossed the road to drink it with Marlene on hers. Some evenings, she would wave at him and he would walk over, and they'd sit side by side watching the sun dip below the horizon without saying much at all. She didn't suddenly become a different person. She was still quiet, still steady. But now her silence had space for him too. The neighborhood noticed too. People began to see them sitting together on the porch, talking softly or simply sharing the quiet. It wasn't a big love story with loud laughter or dramatic moments. It was something softer, older and steadier, like the way the desert holds its warmth long after the sun goes down. One evening, her grandchildren came over. They ran around the yard laughing and playing. Marlene was busy tying their shoelaces and handing out snacks. One of the little girls ran up to David and tugged on his sleeve. "Are you Grandma's friend?" she asked with big, curious eyes. David looked at Marlene, who smiled softly, then nodded. Yes, David said. I guess I am. The girl grinned and ran off to play. That simple word, friend, stayed with David that night. For years he had been a quiet watcher on his porch, convincing himself that was all he could ever be. But now he was more than that. Not because of some big magical moment, but because two quiet people had found a way to share their silence. Seasons changed slowly in the desert, but their routine stayed steady. They shared small things, coffee, stories, moments. When one of Marlene's horses fell ill, David was the first one at her gate to help. When David slipped on the porch one winter morning, Marlene showed up with a pot of warm soup and a soft scolding about being more careful. They never labeled their bond with big words. It didn't need that. It was enough that they understood each other without needing to explain everything. One evening, as the sky glowed a deep orange, David sat beside Marlene on the porch. She leaned back in her chair, her lantern glowing softly between them. Do you ever think about how strange it is? David said quietly. She turned to him. What? He smiled gently. That it took 10 years to cross a road. Marlene chuckled softly. Sometimes people walk slowly for a reason, but they still get there. The wind moved gently between them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out. The horses shifted in their pen. Marlene poured him another cup of coffee, and they sat in peaceful silence. In that moment, David realized that he didn't regret a single one of those 10 years of quiet watching. Those years had built a gentle story between them, a story written in glances, soft smiles, and quiet respect. Their bond was not a loud one. It didn't come with big speeches or sudden changes. It grew like the desert flowers, slow, steady, and strong against the wind. As night fell, the lantern light cast a warm glow across their faces. Marlene leaned back and closed her eyes, listening to the night sounds she loved so much. David looked at her, no longer from a distance, but from right beside her. This was where he was meant to be, not as the silent man on the porch across the road, but as the quiet companion who finally crossed it. And for the first time in many years, the silence between them wasn't just silence anymore. It was shared, warm, and alive.